I decided I better split this lecture into two parts so I didn't choke YouTube. Any rate, I'm hoping you watched the Khan Academy podcast. Since I'm going to go fast, I need to get to Turner and the slave ship. I've mentioned that Romanticism was less fascinated by the classical world and all its philosophy, and more taken with the medieval world and its religion and mysticism. When the medieval complex that housed the British Parliament burned down in 1834, leaving only the medieval Westminster Hall, the British government held a contest to design a replacement. Their stipulation was that the design had to be based on either Elizabethan or Gothic architectural styles. Either one would have been perceived as a return to the good old days, when true craftsmanship prevailed before industrial ready-made, mass-produced goods flooded the market. So we're seeing a certain amount of nostalgia here. So here's the one important portion of the Palace of Westminster that survived the 1834 fire. It's the Hall of Westminster, built by the son of William the Conqueror in 1097. Westminster was the primary residence of the kings of England until a fire destroyed much of the complex in 1512. After that, it served as the home of Parliament, which had been meeting there since the 13th century, and also as the seat of the Royal Courts of Justice, which were based here at Westminster Hall. So let's watch a brief introductory video made by the UK Parliament. This is one of your required images, but I'm guessing it's included mostly to showcase how Barry and Pugin used it as a model for Parliament's interior. And here we see the old and new compared. The central lobby is the heart of the Houses of Parliament, the place where corridors from the Lords, the Commons, and the Westminster Hall all meet. The College Board image doesn't really capture the ceiling, which is quite interesting, so let's watch a very brief clip, also from the UK Parliament. Another influence on the design was the Edward VII Chapel at nearby Westminster Abbey, one of the most famous examples of which Gothic style? Perpendicular Gothic. Maybe it has not disappeared from the AP exam. It's a distinctively British Gothic style distinguished by its rectilinear shapes and its elaborate fan vaulting that you see here on the right, and also remember in Hogwarts. The ceiling echoes, sorry, that was on the left. On the right, the ceiling echoes some of the elaborate geometric design, but the star pattern and the mosaic really reflect Mudehar, that is European Muslim and Byzantine influence, more, I would say, than perpendicular Gothic. But the idea is in some ways the same, a highly decorative geometric ceiling. Okay, finally we come to my favorite Romantic painter and maybe my number 2 artist crush after Caravaggio, so you're warned. Like the paintings we've seen by Géricault and Delacroix, this captured a dramatic current event. Any guess as to what event that was? Well, it was the burning of the Houses of Parliament in 1834 that I just talked about. And it was painted pretty much right after it happened. Turner was actually an eyewitness. He based his painting on sketches he made as he watched the buildings burn. So I've juxtaposed this painting with our required work. Imagine that this is an attribution essay question. And by the way, Turner has showed up frequently in the past on AP exams for attribution. Why is burning the Houses of Parliament clearly a work by Turner? Well, in both paintings, we see the play of light on water, inspired partly by repeated trips he'd made to Venice, which is the city of light on water. We also see the human figures crowded into the foreground, overwhelmed by the forces of nature and by disaster. In other words, we see the sublime. Note the color, the fierce, saturated yellows juxtaposed with blue. These are also characteristic of Turner's work. I'm going to talk more about color theory in a moment. But these bursts, critics said, blobs of pure color, were something new, a foretaste of art that would burst upon Europe in another 40 years with the Impressionists. Note, by the way, I've given a lot of detail in my attribution. One concern I have in essays I've seen is that you're not giving enough detail from paintings, including the painting that's right in front of you. At any rate, we're going to linger, I hope, on the slave ship. Next to the raft of Medusa, this work generated the most past AP questions from this unit, and this one is still on the list, so heads up, okay? But first, I want to look at the development of this remarkable artist. Turner achieved great early success as a landscape painter, rather in the tradition of Constable. But Turner's vision of the British countryside was not always as sentimental as Constable's. His work also foreshadowed developments that would reemerge later in the 19th century with realists such as Courbet. Stay tuned, that's my next lecture. This painting captured the poverty that gripped the English countryside in the hard early years of the Industrial Revolution and the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. Turner, by the way, grew up as a poor Cockney boy in London with a mother who went insane and died in the Bedlam Insane Asylum, which is an unusual social background for a Romantic painter. They were mostly from the upper middle class. Some art historians speculate that this early encounter with madness shows up in the fiery colors of many of his paintings. By the way, when Turner visited France, he met with Delacroix, who was actually a big admirer of his paintings, but was taken aback by Turner in person, whom he thought looked like a farmer with dirty hands. Delacroix also observed that Turner smelled bad. So here's a painting that suggests Turner's fascination with horror, maybe even a little flirtation with insanity. Like Goya, Turner painted his nightmares. In this case, this was probably enhanced by the opium he was taking to treat a lingering and painful illness. The title and image come from the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 8. I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. And here we see Turner's field of Waterloo, the site of England's great triumph over Napoleon. But this too looks more like a work by Goya than a British Romantic. It's all about carnage and loss, and the painting was deeply unpopular at the time. Critics considered it profoundly unpatriotic. In fact, it didn't get a proper display until the 1980s. Turner's experiments with watercolor and with color theory were likewise ahead of his time and inspired Impressionists a generation later. He painted with his fingers as well as with brushes. One reason, presumably, they were dirty. He globbed oil paint onto canvases and then carved into it with his fingernails. This is a non-representational work. In plain English, we really don't know what it's trying to represent. We will see a lot of these, but really not until well into the 20th century. So I've mentioned Goethe, probably the most important Romantic literary figure, at least on the continent. Goethe had a color theory. The plus colors of yellow and red excite lively feelings, while blues impart gloomy and melancholy emotions or the impression of cold. To Goethe, whose writings Turner closely studied, yellow was above all associated with the sun and with energy-given qualities. Goethe also anticipated color theorists by observing that every decided color, this is a quote, does a certain violence to the eye and forces it to opposition. In other words, complementary colors work together optically to combine. Note that Turner makes considerable use of complementary colors, especially yellow and indigo. He also strategically places small dots of colors so that the additive mixture would gain brilliance. We saw that technique in Vermeer's paintings. We will see it much more strongly with the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. Turner actually gave lectures on color and perspective at the British Royal Academy. Turner even imbued the Industrial Revolution with a harsh, austere beauty, as Monet would a generation later in one of our required works from a later unit, which I've stuck on the slide as a teaser. In the Turner painting, we see the locomotive barreling toward us, pumping steam into the air. Like the wild animals of other Romantic paintings, it conveys power and dynamism, and maybe a kind of brute force. So, any guess who painted the work on the bottom right? That's another Valley of Mexico painting by Velasco, this one from 1879. So, is the railroad an element of nature, an invader, both? Note that Turner uses color much more radically, even though his painting dates from 35 years earlier than Velasco's. Okay, Slave Ship. If you skipped the Khan Academy video on this work, may I strongly suggest that you go back and unskip it, please? So here is Simon Schama's account of this painting from the Power of Art series that I like so much. It's a long clip, sorry about that, but I think Schama does a great job of presenting the history behind this painting, talking about its composition and use of color, and introducing a number of romantic elements. When the disembodied voice returns, we will be leaving Romanticism and exploring not only realist paintings, but that radically realist new art medium, photography.